All right. Good morning, and thank you for joining us for our quarterly seminar presentation for the Great Lakes Rural Opioid Technical Assistance Regional Center, funded by SAMHSA. I'm Kelly Cabral, Project Director for the Ohio Youth Resilience Collaborative at Ohio State University. Tapping into Cooperative Extension's strong commitment to healthy individuals, families, and communities, we aim to address opioid and substance use in rural communities across Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Minnesota, Ohio, and Wisconsin. We aim to leverage our deep local ties in rural communities to provide technical assistance in the prevention, intervention, and recovery practices of opioid and related substance use disorders. Our goal is not only to provide educational opportunities, but also to build a toolkit for community resiliency. We invite all participants to send us a resource or a tool related to today's topic if you feel inspired. We will disseminate a toolkit after the seminar so that we may all become better practitioners with wider and deeper resources at the ready. We are continuing to build on the learning from our prior seminars, and we will continue to weave themes of prevention, community, resilience, and hope in future seminars. And just a note here to say that words matter. ROTA-RC promotes the use of affirming person-first language when discussing behavioral health disorders. Non-stigmatizing, recovery-oriented language can help reduce negative bias and promote successful engagement in treatment and recovery. I am so pleased to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Alex Elswick, as he returns to share a new presentation with us. If you've been with us for the last year, you may know him from his presentation on Recovery Capital last March. Dr. Alex Elswick is a tireless advocate for people with substance use disorders. He currently serves the University of Kentucky as an assistant professor and extension specialist for substance use prevention and recovery. Alex is a trained researcher, recovery coach, and mental health therapist, as well as the co-founder of Voices of Hope, a peer-driven recovery community organization. But most importantly, Alex is himself a person in long-term recovery from the chronic disease of addiction. Welcome back, Alex.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that introduction. And I always appreciate the slide related to words matter, using destigmatized language. That's important to me. So appreciate that nod. My name is Alex Elswick. I'm so excited to be back with you all today, and really for a couple of reasons. And the first is because when Pam first reached out to me to ask me about the Surgeon General's report on loneliness and isolation, I didn't know what she was talking about, and that embarrasses me. Anytime something like that happens in my field, in my subject matter, I feel like I should know the lay of the land, and this is significant, and it was a real blind spot. So I was grateful for the opportunity to do a deep dive and to learn a lot more about what is really a public health epidemic in the United States, our epidemic of loneliness and isolation. And I figure I would start by just sharing a little bit about who I am. I don't ever want to spend too much time here. If you were with us for the last session that I had the opportunity to do, I told some of my personal experience with addiction. I promise not to do that here, but I think what's most important today is that I'm a person with social anxiety disorder, and so I have, in many ways, kind of a unique relationship to the subject matter that we're discussing. I have no less of a need for human connection than anybody else on this call. I just kind of have to get it a little differently sometimes. And my best example of this, I'm really comfortable with folks once we're in relationship, but it's that process of developing a relationship and negotiating the boundaries that are going to govern our interactions. That's what makes me really uncomfortable. And so, like, for example, you might walk into a room and you see your peers, you see your colleagues, and you sort of intuitively know, like, person A is someone I walk up and hug, person B is someone I wave to, and person C I don't really acknowledge. And you know that intuitively. For whatever reason, I don't have that. And so I'll see a colleague across the room at a conference or something, and I'll just experience a moment of sheer panic. Like, do I know them well enough that I should go up and say something? How familiar should I be when I say something, and all that? And I get mechanical, and that's what social anxiety is for me. As you heard in the introduction, I'm also a person in recovery from an opioid use disorder. It took me all the bad places that people go, lots of places where I experienced different forms of isolation in jail, in institutions, and experiencing homelessness. And I'm also trained as a clinician. And in particular, I'm trained as a marriage and family therapist. And if you all are familiar with family studies or family therapy, then you'll be familiar with the systems theory and a systemic model of addressing a variety of family health and also family psychopathology. And it's really a nod to the fact that none of us can exist in isolation, that we're all inexorably linked to other people, and that those connections really matter. And so I bring that systemic lens to everything that I do, certainly including addiction work and mental health disorders, and it applies directly to what we're talking about today. But I also found through my experience that my social anxiety made me not a very good clinician. And that sounds like a joke or like false humility, but it's really not. I was really a very anxious person, especially at that stage of my life, and didn't really have all the tools I needed to cope with my anxiety. And I think I transmitted that to clients, and I brought some unnecessary anxiety into the therapy room. So I say that to say I decided to go on to finish my doctorate and become a researcher because it suits a person with social anxiety disorder much more so. I can hide behind computer screens and it's all good. I'm a co-founder of Voices of Hope, and we're a peer-driven recovery community organization. And I just thought it was worth mentioning that because everything that we do at Voices of Hope is centered around connection. It's centered on belongingness first, not on abstinence, not on coercing any pathway of recovery. It's on providing a space for belongingness to the people who need it most in our community. And then lastly, I would say I'm a self-proclaimed lone wolf, and I will acknowledge that that's not a wolf icon there. I couldn't find a wolf icon. The best I could find was a lion, so that's our lone wolf for the day. Just forgive me. I've just always been a person, I think in part because of my social anxiety, who's really comfortable with myself and enjoys the comfort and the company of myself. And I think that that's relevant to our discussion today too. So what we're going to do today is start with a breakout. I'm doing that very intentionally. We'll talk some more about that in a second. Then we'll go through some really important definitions of these related, but also important to differentiate concepts. We'll look a little bit at the trends in loneliness over time and data. We'll look at kind of how we got here, talk about who in particular is experiencing a disproportionate loneliness and disproportionate harms consequent to loneliness. What are those consequences and what can we do about it? So first, what I want to do is I want to jump into an icebreaker, and I'm doing this so intentionally. And so before I give you any more background on that, this is an icebreaker on icebreakers. I want you to spend 5 minutes talking with your partner or whoever is in your room with you, how you feel about icebreakers. What's been your experience using icebreakers? Does anybody feel a little bit miffed that I'm using presentation time on an icebreaker rather than on actually sharing information? That's my question for you. So we're going to try to launch in. And by the way, I'll tell you, I sprung on Kelly, my technical assistance person for the day, all these polls and things. So it may take us a second. And if it does, it's on me. Are we good to go? Yeah, perfect. All right. We'll jump into breakouts now. 5 minutes. How do you feel about icebreakers? What's been your experience? And does it bother you?
So I'm guessing based on the number of people in the room that I'm not the only one.
No one
And
was in my room.
I ended up in a room all by myself as well.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah, I ended up in a room with one person who I not responded to anything.
I'm sorry about that. Yeah, it looks like we've got a group of people who maybe aren't joining the rooms at all.
We all have social anxiety, maybe.
Well, amongst our group that's here, maybe you want to share answers to that. I mean, I certainly have my own social anxieties with icebreakers. At least like leading up to it, I get nervous, like, oh, what am I going to say? And then it happens and you're like, oh, I feel more comfortable after kind of, you break that ice with people, especially if you don't know them. So anyone want to chime in with our very large group that we have here?
I say that's pretty much exactly my sentiment because I have like a love-hate relationship, I guess is what I was gonna say. Because I hate when they're like, okay, now we're gonna do an icebreaker. But I always do enjoy it afterwards. And I like doing them with other groups and making other people do them. I just don't like doing them myself.
I would kind of agree with that too. I think I like doing them as long as for me it's got to be very structured. There's got to be clear guidance. I don't like the open-ended icebreakers that are like, oh, just pair up with somebody and talk about blah blah blah. And I'm like, no, I need much more structure. Like you stand here and you stand here and this is what you discuss. But Alex, I have some social anxiety too historically too. And so I really resonated with the things that you were saying earlier. So thank you for sharing that.
Thanks for saying that.
Alex, we had a group of folks who I think just didn't join rooms. And so we ended up with a larger group here and people came back if they didn't have pairs. So we've
No
just been
worries.
discussing as a group.
That's
It's
perfect.
like
No,
everybody's coming back though. So
okay, perfect. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to close the room here and bring everyone.
Lauren, I appreciated what you shared. If I cued you, would you be willing to share that with the whole group when everybody comes back?
Me?
Lauren,
Oh, sure.
yeah, I just want to kind of piggyback off of that comment if you don't care.
Okay.
All right, everybody's coming back here.
All right. Welcome back, one and all. We were just talking, we had a group of folks who didn't make it into breakout rooms. And so we were just talking as a large group and Lauren just shared something I asked her to share with the whole group. What was your experience with icebreakers?
Yeah, so I was saying like I have a love-hate relationship with icebreakers. I hate when they're in a meeting like we're gonna do an icebreaker. I'm like, oh gosh, but I always do feel better afterwards. I always enjoy it like once it's done, and I like making other groups do icebreakers when I'm leading. But when someone says, okay, now we're gonna do an icebreaker, it's just it's anxiety from the get.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that because that is almost exactly also my experience. I used to really think that icebreakers were silly and that it was a way that presenters were trying to eat presentation time, just to be totally honest. And then at our nonprofit, we worked with a DE&I consultant named Dr. Deidre Hawkins, and she's brilliant. And she really worked with us to help us understand that we have a real white dominant culture that's focused on production and doing, and that doesn't really prioritize connecting. And helped us really understand the value of connecting before correcting and the importance of building rapport, helped us see that so much of our model of a peer-run center was built on rapport and relationship. And as a part of that, helped me understand the value of icebreakers, to get people a little more animated, to get your brains working, to get juices flowing, to get you engaged, to get you connected. And so I hope that was as fun for you as it was for me, an icebreaker on icebreakers. But before we dive in too far, I wanted to just kind of differentiate these two things, loneliness and being alone, because I think one of the things I've learned with my social anxiety in particular is that I can certainly be alone without being lonely, and that I can certainly be lonely when I'm not alone. And so one of the best examples of this for me is we're in the midst of an opioid epidemic, and there are about 3 or 4 FDA-approved medications to treat opioid use disorder. They're incredibly effective, especially buprenorphine and methadone. And so we'll have lots of folks who take those medications because it's the gold standard for their condition, and they'll be court ordered to something like a 12-step program, an abstinence-based 12-step program. And the judge is obviously doing that in good faith, thinking this is a person who needs social support, and indeed they're right. The problem is when that person goes to those meetings, these abstinence-based meetings, they're told that they're not legitimately in recovery, that they're just substituting one drug for another. And so as a result, even though they're sitting in a support group, they're not feeling supported. So they're sitting in the midst of others, but they're not experiencing what you would hope would be the benefits of that. I think anyone who's experienced either chronic depression or even just a period of a really low period in your life, that tends to be a period when people feel most disconnected from the world around them. I think that was certainly the experience that I had. But I was also thinking, I'm remarkably comfortable being alone, and sometimes I feel more connected. So for instance, I really don't mind to be the weirdo who goes and eats a meal in public by myself, and I don't feel alone when I do it. I don't feel, somehow I still feel connected to the world around me, and I think that's a part of kind of understanding how to differentiate these two things. But more important is to differentiate these two things. These are two concepts, two ways that scientists measure lack of social connection. And they're often used in the general public colloquially, like as if they mean the same thing, kind of synonymously, but they're different. They're important to differentiate. So social isolation, which by the way is going to be hard to say over and over again. Social isolation means objectively having few relationships, few social roles, few interactions, few engagements. It's an objective measure of your social engagement. Loneliness, alternatively, is a subjective experience. It's the distressing experience that's often consequent to social isolation, but not always. Sometimes social isolation certainly causes loneliness, but loneliness can also cause social isolation. And I'll talk some more about that and just kind of doing a deeper dive on social anxiety. So we're gonna do a quick poll question. And again, sprung this on Kelly, so we'll see how it goes. It's the basic question. Looking at yourself today versus 10 years ago, do you feel more connected today than you did 10 years ago? Do you feel less connected than you did 10 years ago? Or do you feel kind of no significant change? And answers are pouring in. Thank you all. And thank you, Kelly. I'm glad that all this is working. It makes me happy. So as responses are rolling in, there's a little bit of a mix. Looks like about a quarter would say no change, about a quarter would say more connected, and about half are reporting feeling less connected. And I'll be honest with you, I didn't necessarily know what to expect from that. I just kind of wanted to give us our own context for who we are in the room and how we're feeling. And I think that's not really surprising because that's what the data show in general. That's what we're seeing. So it's important to note that across the board, are you all, by the way, are you all seeing the results that I'm seeing? Are you able to see it on the screen? No, let me see if I can. Okay, it's not important. As I said, 25% said more, about 50% are saying less, and 25% are saying no change. So across the world, not just in the United States, but across the world, adults are reporting higher levels of loneliness than ever before in recorded history. It's really kind of a watershed moment in history in some respects. And it's a public health problem. And we mean that in the same way that we say substance use disorder is a public health problem. We don't mean it's like a public health problem. We mean it is a public health problem. And I think that becomes much more clear when you see some of the consequences that we'll explore a little bit later. So looking at loneliness in the data based on some recent Gallup polls, about 24%, about a quarter of adults worldwide feel very lonely or fairly lonely. Maybe this is roughly consistent with what we got from our own poll. Not entirely surprising to me. What was surprising to me is kind of the demography or the demographics of loneliness. I had always heard that older age that in older age, people experience more loneliness, and there's a variety of reasons for that, like morbidity and mortality. You have more disabilities that limit your ability to connect with others. You have, mortality. People, your contemporaries might be passing away, which is obviously going to lead to less connection. But it surprised me to find that there's higher levels of loneliness being reported among younger adults. And actually, the highest level is reported among emerging adults. And that didn't totally surprise me because I actually did my master's thesis on emerging adults in recovery. And one of the things I learned about this period of like 18 to 25 is that it's marked by remarkable instability, and instability of all kinds: economic instability, residential instability, relationship instability. And it's that period of time when you're kind of, when you're 30 or 40, you're more likely to have a career and a family and to be connected in that way. When you're an adolescent, you're more likely to still be connected with your family of origin, probably living in home. So it's emerging adulthood really is this strange gap where people are really at risk. They're more likely to be socially isolated and more likely to experience loneliness. And I think maybe where we should consider targeting some of these interventions. And then it surprised me just looking at gender that there isn't a significant difference between men and women. And I would have expected, just to be honest, that women would report higher levels of loneliness, just based on like maybe a social desirability bias or something like that. But it seems that regardless of gender, irrespective of that, we all need connection. It's a really vital part of our health and wellness. So second breakout, using breakouts intentionally here. We got this and then one more. My question for you is, why are we so lonely? And what's causing this trend? And so after we come back, I'm going to offer you a lot of my own ideas and a lot of the suggestions in the Surgeon General's report. But before I kind of polluted your minds with that, I wanted to just get your own gut level reaction. Why are we so lonely as a society? Why are you lonelier than you were 10 years ago? What's the cause of this? So we'll take 10 minutes. You get 5 minutes each person. We can try to roughly share speaking time.
Alex, do you still want pairs, or should we try to have a few more?
Yeah, a few more would be great if we can.
Okay. And do you want to be in the breakout room?
Yes, please. That's great.
Okay. All right. Here we go.
There we go. Okay, sorry, I was muted. All right, everybody. Kelly, did we get everybody back now? Just about. Yes, perfect. Thank you. So really interesting. I hope you all had as fun of a group as I did. I was in with Jennifer and Katie, and we were talking about lots of things that have changed in society that we can attribute it to. We talked a lot about technology and how it's ironically made us both more connected, but subjectively less connected, and yet that maybe technology is here to stay. And so maybe we have to find a way to reckon with it. I think there are a lot of factors, but I want to suggest a few that I think are really significant. And the first relates to trust. There's a relationship between trust and loneliness, particularly in a broader societal context. So trust in individuals, in each other, and in major institutions is at historic lows. In 1972, 45% of Americans reliably trusted other Americans. In 2016, only 30% of Americans reliably trusted other Americans. And I would point out that these data are a little bit outdated. You know that we have this really strong upswing of political polarization, so strong, in fact, that I don't even want to talk much about it because I don't want to risk offending anyone. You know, that's how polarized it's become. But it's worth pointing out that a considerable amount of that polarization has been since 2016. So in the last 8 years. So I think it would be pretty fair to argue that probably trust in major institutions and in one another is lower than even 30% at historical lows. We're also seeing trends in what you would expect in the objective measures of social isolation. So more time spent alone has increased 24 hours per month. That's a considerable amount of time spent alone. I think our group would suggest that's probably time spent alone with phone in hand, doom scrolling. Household family social engagement decreased 5 hours per month. And I think to all of us on this call, whether you work in extension or as a social worker or any kind of helping profession, you know the significance of those family social engagements. You know how few and far between they are already. So a decrease of 5 hours in the last 20 years is significant. You know, thinking about family dinners and things like that. Social engagement with friends has decreased a whopping 20 hours per month. I am super guilty of that. I know that for me, that's part of my lack of social connection is in spending too much time at work and not enough time connecting with my peers. Social engagement with others in general decreased 10 hours per month. And again, I would point out that these data are as of 2020. And so you can imagine that the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated all of those things and increased maybe all of those except for family social engagement may have increased just because we were forced to be together, possibly. You know. So who is lonely? I think one of the things I wanted to make sure everyone took away from today is number one, chiefly that loneliness is a public health epidemic. That we're not saying it's epidemic because it's like that. We're saying it meets the public health criteria. This is a public health burden and we need to address it. But at the same time, there are certain groups who are bearing the disproportionate share of the loneliness burden. And we talked about younger and older adults both when we looked at kind of the age discrepancies, but also people who live alone. So whether you're a single adult, whether you're a young adult who's still, dating and transitioning, all of those things in a sort of an obvious way create risk for loneliness. But disabilities of any kind, disabilities as broadly as you can possibly define it, physical disabilities, chronic diseases, mental or cognitive disorders, psychiatric disorders, mental health illnesses, all of those disabilities have the effect of creating risk for loneliness. It doesn't mean that it necessarily makes you lonely, right? But certainly a physical disability, if you are, maybe lack some mobility, you're going to be less able to go and physically be around people. Certainly if you have, certain psychiatric impairments, you're going to be less able to connect with others. But then think about existing at one of these intersections. So I'm going to flip back for just a second. Imagine having a chronic disease or a physical disability or a psychiatric health condition and being low income and being a person who's immigrated. or having a minoritized identity. I'll share some more about in a moment, some research I got to do with LGBTQ youth and really understanding the experience of minority stress a little differently. People who live in rural areas or transit deserts, I was just reflecting on this. Earlier this month, I did a county program review in Pike County, Kentucky, which, if you aren't familiar, is far eastern Kentucky. It's, Appalachian Kentucky. It's pretty impoverished. And part of what I learned on my trip is that Pike County is the second largest county in terms of geographical space east of the Mississippi River. And the reason that's really relevant to this conversation is because it is kind of a quintessential transit desert. It's a huge geographical space. It's really mountainous, so it's really hard to build infrastructure to directly connect people. So people are quite literally physically and geographically isolated. And so it might make sense then that they're more likely to experience loneliness. And of course, people who have been victims of violence, of abuse, of all forms of trauma, the experience of victimization is an isolating experience. It's often part of what marks those experiences. And in terms of consequences, some of these are shocking. And I'll tell you, I think for me, the mental health consequences were mostly intuitive and kind of logical, because I thought, sure, if you're lonely, you're more likely to experience some type of mental distress. But I was shocked to learn the connection between loneliness and physical health. So loneliness is associated with an increased risk of heart disease by 29%, of stroke by 32%, of high blood pressure, diabetes, obesity, disruptions in appetite and sleep. And it just occurs to me that all of those are, that's just symptomatic of a physical disorder. It's not, it's not like it's a physical disorder. It's people are having physical consequences to loneliness that are very real. And it, I think, is at least vaguely tantamount to trauma. And to the way that, adverse childhood experiences disproportionately increase a child's risk when they grow up, not just of experiencing different kind of psychiatric comorbidities, but also lots of physical comorbidities. People who've experienced trauma are more likely to have diabetes and all sorts of these things. So maybe a relationship there. Another way of thinking about the physical health consequences, it's estimated that loneliness is the health equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes per day. And I mean, it looks like you're smoking filtered cigarettes there, so that's some harm reduction. I suppose that's good. But for those of you who haven't smoked, 15 cigarettes is 3/4 of a pack. That's almost a pack a day. That's, as we know, really tragically bad for our health. And yet I don't think hardly any of us would consider loneliness to be that big of a problem. And yet it is. It's that big of a burden on our physical health. In terms of alcohol, loneliness is the health equivalent of about 6 alcoholic drinks per day. And by the way, this is to the chagrin of many, but I know there's been a long-standing debate about the health consequences of alcohol and are there some heart-related benefits and all this. The scientific consensus today is that there's not a safe amount of alcohol, that any amount of alcohol is harmful to your body, but certainly more alcohol is more harmful. And certainly 6 drinks per day represents a binge drinking disorder and perhaps an alcohol use disorder, serious consequences. In terms of mental health, some of these, the depression and anxiety didn't surprise me. I expected those, maybe just from my therapy, my clinical experience. I expected those to follow from loneliness. That makes sense. But an increase in risk for dementia by 50%. And relatedly, people who are lonely experience cognitive decline 20% faster than people compared to those who would not report loneliness. Loneliness has a real profound impact on not just our social lives, but on all these biopsychosocial elements of our lives. And I wanted to point this out just as a person with social anxiety. And this is a lesson that I've known as a consequence of my social anxiety for a long time. But I think it's something that a lot of other people had to learn a little bit during the pandemic. And that is this relationship between isolating and being anxious, because when I started to develop social anxiety, then of course it made me want to isolate. It made me want to avoid social situations because they're causing me angst. But what I learned over time is the more that I avoided social situations, the more that I was spending time like ruminating on social situations and becoming anxious about them, which in turn made me want to avoid them even more, which becomes a really vicious cycle. And I think to some extent, maybe some of you experienced a bit of that during the pandemic when just a little bit in the reverse. You were forced into social isolation in a way you hadn't ever been forced to before. And I heard people talking about how that created in them some anxiety about going back to work, about getting back into routine, about having to see some of the same old people. And it was that disruption in normalcy that kind of led to that experience. So they really can exacerbate each other in some interesting ways. Social isolation is the single strongest and most reliable indicator of suicidal ideation, suicide attempts, and lethal suicide behavior. And so relatedly, I had the opportunity in 2019 to publish some research with some of my colleagues, mental health disparities and high-risk alcohol use among non-heterosexual high school students. We were looking at data taken from the 2015 Kentucky Youth Risk Behavior Survey, Kentucky-specific data, a cross-sectional survey taken at one point in time, over 2,500 students. And we were trying to primarily do two things. One, to examine the frequency of depression, suicidal ideation, and these high-risk alcohol behaviors as stratified by sexual orientation. And then to examine the mitigating impact of having an adult that they could talk to on all of those outcomes. And so just really quickly, some of what we found that I think is interesting and tragic, of course, non-heterosexual students, so broadly LGBTQ students, were almost 4 times as likely to hurt themselves in a suicide attempt as their heterosexual counterparts. They were almost 3 times as likely to try alcohol before the age of 18, much higher rate of past 30-day alcohol use, and also binge drinking. Kids, LGBTQ youth, non-heterosexual youth reported being 2.9 times more likely to be sad or hopeless. And hopelessness is a particular risk factor for suicide. 3.22 times more likely to consider attempting suicide, 2.7 times more likely to make a plan, 3.3 times more likely to attempt, and almost 4.4 times more likely to actually hurt themselves. But what was most interesting to me, none of that necessarily surprised me, the increased risk as a consequence of minority stress. But what I found to be most profound about our study was that having a trusted adult, in particular a non-parental adult, that these students could talk to was statistically significantly protective against all of the negative outcomes. So it mitigated the risk for suicide ideation, for suicide attempt, for actually hurting themselves, for feeling hopelessness. That's more effective than millions of dollars worth of interventions. And that's just a single social connection. I think that's a profound return on investment, profound cost benefit analysis, the importance of human connection. And it might seem a little tacky to talk about economics or finances after talking about suicide and minority stress, but it is a reality that loneliness has economic consequences as well, to the tune of about $406 billion a year. And that's predominantly due to lost productivity as a consequence of the fact that when we're lonely, you can sort of think of loneliness as a form of biopsychosocial stress. That's kind of what we learned from those consequences. And so when people are experiencing biopsychosocial stress and their cortisol levels are raised, and it compromises their ability to do all sorts of things, including their ability to be a good employee. There's also an additional estimated $6.7 billion a year in Medicare costs for socially isolated older adults. And part of what this article, the authors of this article argue is much of that additional $6.7 billion in Medicare costs for socially isolated older adults is exacerbations of the consequences of their different disabilities. In other words, if these older adults were more connected, despite the fact that they have these disabilities, they wouldn't be experiencing as many harms as a consequence of those disabilities. Social connection is really, really imperative. And as I was doing my deep dive on social connection, I came across something just a little bit nerdy that I thought I'd throw in here. And I only recognized the name Durkheim because I'd read I've been forced to read some Emile Durkheim in college, in my undergrad. And in 1897, he wrote a book called Les Suicides, where he was documenting these suicides that he called anomic suicides. And in that context, he basically meant people who were alienated. And he was suggesting in the book that these deaths are attributed to a breakdown in communal spirit, sort of like the fraying social fabric and the decrease in trust that I described before. And I think that's incredibly prescient. I mean, probably that does characterize what was happening at that time, but it's fascinating to me that he said that in the 19th century and that we're seeing something very similar today. So again, this is a little bit dated based on 2018 data, but these are called deaths of despair. This is a heat map of deaths of despair. And deaths of despair account for 3 different kinds of mortality: alcohol-related mortality, overdose mortality, and suicide mortality. And what you see is maybe not surprising, but is a really hot burning coal right over Appalachia, the Ohio Valley, Pike County, where I was just describing, in Eastern Kentucky, disproportionate deaths of despair there. And it's probably not surprising. If you go back and think about so many of the risk factors we talked about, like being geographically isolated, being in a transit desert, there are a variety of reasons, probably the disproportionate number of disabilities among that community, probably a variety of reasons there. Something else that we talked about at length, at least in my breakout session, was social media and technology. And I thought, of course, we'd be remiss not to acknowledge this. I told my group, every time I walk into my classroom, I teach freshmen in the honors college at University of Kentucky. And every time I walk in the classroom, their heads are all craned down looking at their phones. And I don't feel the need to pick on them, but I tell them every once in a while that, you know, when I was young and we didn't have cell phones, or at least everyone didn't have a cell phone, you'd walk into class and you'd actually have to have a social interaction with each other. You'd actually have to make eye contact with people. You'd have to interact. And that's necessarily something that's been lost over time. Americans spend an average of 6 hours a day on digital media. And I don't know if your phone, if you have an iPhone, if it gives you that that alert at the end of each week that says you spent X number of hours on your phone last week. I feel burning intense shame every single time I see that, because whatever it is, I know it's too much. And 1/3 of US adults report being online almost constantly. And related to that, that reminded me that I'd heard about these right to disconnect laws. I'm wondering if you all are familiar with these. I first heard about it in France, but I understand that there are many other countries that have followed suit. And right to disconnect laws require bigger organizations, so organizations of more than 50 employees, to forbid their employees from sending or replying to emails on off hours. And, you know, it came out, I think, partly I don't hold me to this, but if I remember correctly, it was partly as a consequence of the pandemic, where people were working remotely, working virtually, but somehow also forced to be on call like 18 hours a day because you couldn't get away from your email and you couldn't get away from your cell phone. And it was a way that the French government and the French Health Service was recognizing this is taking a toll, a public health toll, and we need to enact policies to do something about that. So it's always helpful to have a little bit of a logic model. This is the way that, this is taken directly from the Surgeon General's report. This is kind of their diagram for the way that social connection impacts these health outcomes. And it's primarily mediated by these 3 processes: a biological, psychological, and social process. So you can think about social connection doing lots of different things. Social connection impacts stress hormones. So I talked about this earlier a little bit, but social connection actually reduces cortisol levels, and research shows this pretty consistently. It's even true of people with social anxiety, that once you break through your initial anxiety, that in general, social interaction tends to make us feel connected. So just like somebody suggested after our initial breakout today, that she really doesn't really like the idea of breakouts, doesn't tend to look forward to them, but tends to feel a little better after she does them. And I think that's true of a lot of human connection. We benefit from it more than we even anticipate we will. Social connection can also impact gene expression. So if you're familiar with epigenetics, and the way that genetic material can be switched on or switched off by different experiences. Social connectedness can either, a lack of social connectedness, for instance, might trigger the onset of depression or anxiety or social anxiety or whatever it is that you're at risk and you have the genetic material for. Whereas, alternatively, if you have adequate social connection and you grow up in an environment where, your caregiver is always available and always responsive and you experience a lot of connection, then maybe those genetic material doesn't get triggered and you don't ever experience the onset of these clinical disorders, I think it's interesting that the authors of the diagram suggest meaning and purpose as the most important psychological aspect of social connection mediating health, because this relates, in my mind at least, when I've always been a person who, like, if I walk into a room, I get noticed. And I really don't mean that in an arrogant way. I hope I communicate this the right way. I just mean I'm privileged. I'm over 6 feet tall. I'm pretty broad-shouldered. I'm kind of hard to miss. So if I walk into a room, people usually at least notice me, at least acknowledge me. And that's something that I took for granted, because when I was homeless, especially in Dayton towards the very end, I experienced what it was like for people to either ignore you or actively try to avoid you. And I just realized that so much of meaning and purpose, it comes through our social experiences. We kind of can derive our meaning from those social relationships and from those connections. Certainly hopefulness is related to social connection. And so you think about every major epidemic or every major public health problem facing our country today, whether it's opioids, whether it's obesity and diabetes, whether it's whatever it is. What the research shows is that social connection is one of the most effective ways to mitigate those impacts. It's not something that we need, that we can continue like waiting as like a byproduct. What I mean by that is we have to prioritize social connection like it's the actual outcome that we hope to see. And one of the most helpful ways to me to understand the significance of social connection comes from the brain. And so I'll do just the tiniest little bit of brain science with you. If you put your hand out in front of you and you tuck your thumb into your palm and you wrap your 4 fingers around your thumb, that'll give you a little brain. And if you talk to like an evolutionary biologist, they'll tell you that our brains evolved inside out. So the outside part of our brain, the cortices, represent the most highly and recently developed parts of our brain. But if you peel back those cortices and you go more towards the middle of the brain, towards your thumb, then you get to the limbic system, to what we call the survival circuitry. And this is the part of your brain where survival behaviors are rewarded. Pro-survival behaviors are rewarded. So drinking water, eating food, and bonding with another human being. That's how critical social connection is. It's right there with food and water, that it's literally a core biological drive that we've evolved over time. And so it shouldn't be surprising then that social interactions have a real, tangible, concrete reward. So this is a paper that was published back in 2010, and the title kind of says it all: the rewarding nature of social interactions. And basically, the authors explain from a neuroscience perspective that social interaction, pro-social interaction, upregulates dopamine, which means not only do you get a spike of dopamine, which makes you feel good as a consequence of social interaction, but your dopamine baseline levels are actually raised, which is only a good thing for all of us. And so in that way, it's sort of like, I like to say that social connection is organic medicine to the addicted brain. It's organic medicine to the part of your brain that gets addicted. So one of the most significant things that we could do to address the opioid crisis, the rising methamphetamine and stimulant crisis, whatever it is, the overdose crisis, is connection. And yet, ironically, we do the opposite. Most of our policies, most of our social attitudes really drive people who use drugs to the margins. And I know this isn't all about loneliness among people who use drugs, but I just think that's a really interesting connection. So what can we do about it? These are the 6 pillars that the Surgeon General, the Office of the Surgeon General, recommends to advance social connection. And I think I think they're thoughtful, is what I would say. I think they're thoughtful. And the first is to strengthen social infrastructure. And I think this is brilliant. This is important. The built environment has a lot in terms of shaping these biopsychosocial outcomes. And a really good example of this comes from a colleague of mine who used to be at UK. Her name's Dr. Natalie Jones, used to be at UK. Now she's at Duke University. And she did a lot of work when she was here on walkability in rural communities, making rural communities more walkable. And one of the things she talked about is not only were walkable communities more likely to get people out and moving and more physical activity, which impacted the diabetes prevention and obesity prevention and all that, but also it got people more connected because it got people involved in life. It got people out and moving. And that's a really interesting consequence of a really simple change in built environment. Some added sidewalks, some added greenery, some added gathering spaces, whether that's in public, in a municipal sense, excuse me, or whether that's in our classrooms or in our, building kind of our culture within our work community or whatever it is. It's enacting pro-connection public policies. And so this immediately makes me think back to that right to disconnect law, which ironically, the desired outcome of the right to disconnect law is that people will be able to disconnect from work so that they can better connect with their families and the people that they love. I think mobilizing the health sector is an important, again, tacit acknowledgement that this is a public health problem, and therefore it's going to require public health solutions and certainly the involvement of all of our public health practitioners and our doctors and our nurses. As we talked about in my breakout, reforming the digital environment is probably going to be one of the most significant things we can do to address technology. I shared that I had a supervisor when I was going through my clinical work who kind of warned us, like, don't be all woe is me and fatalistic about technology and social media. And he said, technology isn't evil. Technology is neutral. And what we need to do is get better at finding ways to use it to our benefit and not to our detriment. And maybe that's obvious to some of you. That was kind of the first time I've heard it said that way. And I think he's right. And I think it relates exactly to this conversation, that we have to find a way for all this digital connection to serve us so that we actually experience connectedness rather than whatever it is that we might be experiencing instead. Need to continue to do research to understand what is causing loneliness, who's at the greatest risk, what targeted interventions are effective, and most importantly, build a culture of connection. And to me, the way that I understand this is it says, if we're building a culture of connection, that means we're building a cultural value around connection. And if you value connection, it means you're going to prioritize it. It means it might be something you're going to evaluate when you evaluate programs. And I think about that a lot in the extension world, because so much of what extension does in my line of work is just bring people together, is be a convener and a connector of people. It doesn't matter if we're doing recovery gardens or we're doing a nutrition toolkit or we're doing a homemakers club, whatever it is, it's convening people and it's really facilitating connection in some significant ways. And I think part of what we need to do as a society, as a community, as a university, in academia is to prioritize connection, as this is actually something that we value. So with our last few minutes, we're going to jump into one final breakout in the spirit of connection. Take 10 minutes, 5 minutes apiece, or if you have a few more, just try to share as equitably as you can. I have two questions, and the first is for you, and the second is for your work. So first, what is one thing that you can do for yourself to increase your social connectedness? Anything under the sun, big or small. I just want to know what's something you think you could do that would make you feel more connected to the world around you, soon, tomorrow. And then secondly, what's something that you can do for your community, whether that's for a specific target population, a new program, a new idea, or just a new strategy on how to go forward. So let's jump into those breakouts, take about 10 minutes, and then we'll come back together and kind of wrap it up.
All right, and I'm trying to make it so we have a little larger groups this time so that we don't have any two-person groups. So here we go.
All right, welcome back, one and all, one and all. A little bit of what we heard in my group is something that's really a similar theme, I think, to what I heard in the second breakout, which is that you can actually have too many social engagements that can cloud your social connection, which is a weird thing to think about. But I think it's absolutely true that if you have overly packed your schedule and there's so many tasks, then there's no time for people, even if many of the tasks involve interacting with people. So that's really interesting to think about. And I'll tell you that I have a social interaction. I go to the gym with my buddy every single morning, and that's oftentimes the most significant social interaction I have in a day outside of sitting at my computer on Zooms. And so part of what I am trying, since I started building all this slide deck, I've just been thinking, I'm trying to be more intentional about connecting with a different person who's important in my life each week. And so I'm just making it a goal, real simple. It's not profound. I'm just, like lunch with mom. I got to reach out. I got to connect. I got to be the one. So that's going to be my best approach. That's all I have for you today. Are there any questions that came through the chat that I can answer? I'll do my best, but I'll also tell you, like I've told my breakout groups, this is not my expertise. I'm super comfortable talking substance use and addiction. This is just a deep dive I did here, but I'm happy to try to answer any questions that we have.
I think we had one early on that I'm not sure if you'll be able to answer or not, but asking if social anxiety possibly is related to being on the spectrum.
Actually, I can at least speak somewhat intelligently to this. Yes, there are 5 psychiatric disorders that have strongly related genetic material, and they include anxiety, ADHD, autism. There are 2 others that I can't remember, but I think it's shared genetic material, very similar genetic risk factors, and then they kind of get expressed somewhat similarly. So oftentimes, you might have a child who's autism spectrum but misdiagnosed with anxiety or social anxiety or that sort of thing, and it's not always that the diagnoses make that much of a difference, but they're definitely related in that way. And I think that's, you see social deficits in even people with really, really mild autism. I share this with permission. My younger sister, Katie's adopted from Seoul, South Korea. She is awesome. She's 4 years younger than me. But she's probably on the mild end of the autism spectrum, and it's just a real challenge for her to connect with others. It really is, despite concerted efforts and despite still a very genuine desire to be connected with the people around her. So I think that's just an interesting observation someone's made. And then someone else said in the chat something it's a comment that I just think is worth repeating. It's just, someone said, society puts so much pressure on depressed individuals to reach out when depression largely hinders our ability to reach. And I really appreciate that, because I think that's part of kind of what I was getting at with that cycle, that social anxiety and loneliness kind of getting worse and worse and worse, that it really has a way of exacerbating itself, and the consequences of loneliness then can make us more lonely and consequently make us more isolated. And then someone's just said, Alex, your background in addiction is spot on for this topic of social isolation. Active substance use disorder is often the disease of social isolation. Family and friends are told to do tough love, stop engaging. Yes. Oh, I love it. It's like you've been listening to us talk about harm reduction and rock bottom and all that. You're great, Jody. I totally agree. And I think that's the best place to leave us off today. I do think this is intimately related to substance use, and it's intimately related to all of the big public health problems that we face in the United States. And it's a pretty easy thread to start pulling on. Connection. I think in some ways it's low-hanging fruit. How can we focus more on it? Connection as an outcome, that sort of thing. So thanks for joining me. I hope you enjoyed the icebreakers a little bit and that you didn't find it a complete waste of time. I think they're valuable. I think they get us more engaged than we otherwise would be. So
Thank you so much, Alex. I'm just going to quickly share, if folks have other questions for Alex, you're welcome to hang out and ask after. I just want to share a couple of things from our team here. Our next seminar will be in June. If you've been with us, we do these quarterly. And we'll be talking about addressing stress, social determinants of health and resilience in rural communities with Brenda Mack. And I'm so excited to hear her talk. She grew up on a family farm, is married to a farmer. She kind of has that background and will be speaking from that lens. So that will be a really great presentation in June. I'll make sure I send out the registration information for you all in our follow-up email. Also, if you are not on our mailing list yet, if someone forwarded this to you, we can make sure you get added so that we have events that Ohio State hosts, but we also have events from our partner institutions as well across the region. So lots of good things to connect to. And then I'm going to drop in the chat I'm going to drop our evaluation for today. Would really appreciate if you could take just a couple moments to complete that. So thanks everyone for joining us, and we hope to see you in June.
And Kelly, thank you again for your help today. If there's a next time, I'll give you more notice on our technique, but you handled that very adeptly and astutely. So thank you.
Sounds good. Yeah, this is the world we live in now, right? We just kind of got to be ready to jump in and do it. So,
Well, you figured it out on the fly. So thank you for that.
yeah, absolutely.